Welcome to Gomo Talks about the Crusades and Anti-Zionism. To my mind, the Crusades and Anti-Zionism share striking parallels. Not necessarily in the way that might be instinctive to some, but when explored, I think the overlap will be appreciated by anyone willing to honestly consider the claim. Before I compare the two, though, we must understand what the Crusades involved, when they happened, why they happened, who undertook them, and what motivated those people. So the Crusades essentially begin in 1095, when Pope Urban II calls for a military campaign in Clermont in modern-day France. And the immediate impetus for what became known as the First Crusade was a request for help from the Eastern Roman Empire. You see, in 395 CE, the Roman Empire splits into two: a broadly Latin-speaking and Catholic West, and a Greek-speaking and Orthodox Christian East. And the Western Empire includes much of Western Europe, with the Eastern Empire, what some call today the Byzantine Empire, having its capital in Constantinople, today's Istanbul, and ruling much of southeastern Europe. The Eastern Empire also governs places like Egypt, Syria, and Jerusalem, the birthplace of Christianity and its earliest centers of gravity for centuries. By 1095, though, the Eastern Roman Empire is in serious trouble. The Western Empire essentially fell in 476, and then with the rise of Islam in the 7th century, the Eastern Empire began to lose its territories in the Middle East to a succession of often competing Arab caliphates. But just like today, Christian minorities remain, and Christian pilgrimages to sites like Jerusalem continue. Now, different Islamic regimes engage in varying levels of restriction, taxation, and outright persecution. For example, in 1009, the Fatimid Caliph even partially destroys the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the church associated with Jesus' crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. So very important. But by 1095, the greatest threat to the Eastern Roman Empire is not the Arab caliphates. It's a new force in the region called the Seljuk Turks. These are relatively recent converts to Islam and a nomadic people from Central Asia. And they're conquering territory from the Eastern Roman Empire and Arab caliphates alike. Now, even though Western Europe doesn't share any borders with the Seljuks, they also feel very much under threat. In 711, the Arab Umayyad Caliphate began the Islamic conquest of most of what is today Spain and Portugal. The Umayyads even briefly reach as far as central France before being defeated in the Battle of Tours. So when the Eastern Roman Emperor sends Pope Urban II a plea for help in fighting the Seljuk Turks, this sincerely resonates with many people in the West, despite their centuries of disagreements. Pope Urban II likely looked at the crisis as an opportunity, both to help the Eastern Empire, this other Christian empire under threat, but also as an unexpected opening to leverage that assistance and assert Catholic influence over the Orthodox East. In addition to that, Western Europe is facing significant internal challenges of its own that the Pope likely hoped the Crusades could address. And one of these is a phenomenon known today as elite overproduction. Essentially, Western medieval nobility was closely linked to the ownership of land and the right and ability to exercise violence, the knight being this central figure in this paradigm. And whilst the nobility only made up a small segment of society, recent population growth and inherent practices mean that many younger nobles feel they're being offered fewer opportunities for land than nobles in the past. More and more young nobles view themselves as military, economic, and cultural elites by birthright, but without the resources and prestige they feel they deserve. So Pope Urban II likely sees the Eastern Emperor's call for help as a potential pressure valve to release this pent-up frustration, which was very concerning. And so there are quite a few potential benefits to the Pope. But what could be in it for people who might go and fight themselves? Some people might imagine that Crusaders would have been motivated by an opportunity to become wealthy. Perhaps the very same young nobles who were dismayed in not having enough land, enough prestigious land, or younger sons unlikely to inherit at all, hope to take land in the East or even to cart off riches. But we know that for nobles who did go on crusade, it was extraordinarily expensive. And this obligated many crusaders to sell or lease their land in a manner that many never recovered from. For some nobles, the cost of crusading was losing their noble status entirely. Also, there's a very real risk of death. And for who? As we said earlier, there's disagreements between those in Western Europe and the Eastern Roman Empire. Allyship is not a given. And if there's a threat from Islam, and this is a pressing concern, surely for people in the West, the far more pressing concern is not the Seljuk Turks in the East, but the Muslim presence far closer in Spain. So here I think Pope Urban offers something that expertly addressed the mindset of his audience. Western Europeans at this time are obsessed with concepts of guilt and sin. The Catholic doctrine suggests that people are born with original sin and face a lifelong, constant battle of repentance to escape the very tangible threat of eternal damnation in hell. And the nobility has reason to be concerned more than most. Violence was generally considered a sin, but the entire nature of the nobility is associated with the right and ability to engage in violence. So here Pope Urban II really narrows down on what his audience will be prone to responding to. He suggests that not only would participating in this war not be considered sinful, but that it in and of itself could serve as penance or remission for other sins. It's also worth understanding that Catholics at this time had a very binary way of viewing the world. Non-Catholics, and certainly non-Christians, are perceived as infidels. The Catholic world is divinely blessed, and the non-Christian world as fundamentally evil. Crusading language often spoke about Arabs, Turks, and Muslims, or this broader term Saracens, in demonic language. And just as insufficient personal status felt like a structural affront to the cosmic order for some nobles, that the Catholic and Christian world was being attacked and even defeated by non-Christians was incomprehensible. It was intolerable. So what did this all mean for people hearing the call to the Crusades? It meant that a people racked by fear of sin and punishment could now undertake God-sanctioned violence and be redeemed by it. And I think this was a sincerely powerful motivator. After all, what could be more high status than fighting a holy war against the forces of darkness themselves in defense of God? And so quickly, this call to defend the Eastern Empire expands, the mission expands. And included becomes a desire to liberate formerly Christian lands more broadly, to defend Christians under Islamic rule themselves, and to fight for Jesus by rescuing his holy sites in Jerusalem. And very telling is the fact that throughout the Crusades, a common rallying cry is the Latin Deus vult, or God wills this, which suggests that the Crusaders have this sincere conviction that they are agents in a divine plan for humanity and the world. And that's powerful. So nobles in significant numbers take an oath, vowing to liberate Jerusalem, sewing crosses onto their clothing as a public sign of their commitment. And it's from this act, these people who bear the cross, that we get this term, Crusaders. At the same time, something entirely unexpected, probably for the Pope, and likely undesirable occurs. Masses of non-nobles become inspired by the call to crusade as well. Not the military elite, and not the people the Pope believed he was speaking to, but people who hear this offer of the remission of sin, of attaining status, and maybe even excitement and adventure, are attracted to the call. And so months before the Crusades are ready to begin, the official crusade, whole armies of peasants and lesser nobles simply set off on their own and begin literally walking east towards Jerusalem. And this becomes known as the People's Crusade. And sources speak of mass hysteria amongst them as they plunder their way through farms and towns for food as they travel. And whilst the Pope called for the crusade against Muslims, members of the People's Crusade conclude that if this is a cosmic war of universal good versus evil, surely cleansing their land of infidels that are at home is the necessary first step. And who are the infidels at home? The Jews. So Western Europe at this time is home to small communities of Jews who, although originally from Judea, had come to Western Europe as traders during the early Roman Empire or through the process of exile from Judea by the Roman conquest itself. And Jews are allowed to periodically live in Catholic Europe, but they face serious persecution and restrictions regarding things like where they can live and their professions and violence. Now, the official church doctrine is interesting. So it suggests that all people are sinners, but Jews are more sinful still. They're often labeled at this time children of the devil, and they are said to bear what is perhaps the greatest sin of all, collective responsibility for the murdering of God in the form of Jesus, intergenerationally. And so the church doctrine is that they're to be kept alive, but as a disempowered minority, a living testament to the sin, to their sin, and the eternal victory of the church over the synagogue. So Jews can live, but only if they agree to have no agency, to play no role in shaping themselves or the world around them. To be condemned as props in support of other people's faith and ideals, which I think you'll agree is a pretty precarious existence. So when the People's Crusade begins massacring Jews in horrific acts of indiscriminate violence, certain members of the church and nobility express shock. But despite this, doctrine doesn't change, and the safety and security of Jews in Western Europe is only going to get worse. Ultimately, the People's Crusade, after these massacres, are the first to reach Constantinople, the Eastern Roman capital, much to the horror of the Eastern Romans. They're quickly escorted past the city into the Seljuk-held territory, and when they encounter the Seljuk army, they're comprehensively defeated. And most of them are killed, with survivors sold into slavery. The official, or what becomes known as the Prince's Crusade, is far more successful short term. They come by land and sea, and once they're past Constantinople, they move along the Mediterranean coast, and as they advance, they conquer a lot of territory. But they seem to have great difficulty distinguishing between the people they encountered. They confuse Turks, Arabs, and caliphates for each other, and even Eastern Christians, killing them as well at times, the very people they were allegedly there to defend. So after they capture some key cities from the Seljuks, they ultimately reach Jerusalem, which was under the control of the Fatimid Arab Caliphate at that time. And sources speak of the Crusaders being in ecstasy when they entered Jerusalem itself. This conquest also involved extraordinary violence. Muslims and Jews are massacred, including the burning of a synagogue with much of the surviving Jewish community inside. And Jews are yet again expelled from Jerusalem. Ultimately, though, the Crusaders don't return most of the land they conquered to the Eastern Romans. Instead, they establish their own Catholic Crusader states. So rather than marking a return to Byzantine rule, or even ultimately a permanent return to Christian rule, the Crusades actually galvanize and help unite much of an otherwise divided Islamic world, making few allies in the process. And in the end, the Crusaders lose Jerusalem, and their last foothold in the Holy Lands in Akko, northern Israel today, in 1291. But multiple crusades are called in the interim, including the Fourth Crusade, which sees Crusaders in 1204 attacking and sacking the Eastern Roman capital, Constantinople itself. So the Crusades failed to liberate formerly Christian lands, or Eastern Christians long term. And they so weakened the Eastern Roman Empire so as to, in many ways, assist in its ultimate fall in 1453. And today, the Eastern Roman Empire does not exist. And Constantinople is the Turkish city of Istanbul. Also, the cost of crusading, rather than increasing the power of the nobility at scale, sees in some ways their power decreased, and the power of more centralized monarchies increased at their expense. And what follows is an internalization of the very violence Pope Urban II was likely hoping to export. Crusading continues, but often against other Christians and other Europeans. Rather than a pressure valve, the Crusades compound violence in all directions. And despite expressing horror at the massacre of Jews at the time of the First Crusade, subsequent defeats overseas lead many in the church and nobility to increase the persecution of Jews as the Crusades progress. Eventually, many Jews are expelled from Eastern Europe en masse. Many expelled from what is today England, France, and Germany, ultimately fleeing to Poland in the 16th century. Today, the Crusades are widely viewed as misguided and a stain on those who engaged in them. But instinctively rejecting the Crusades as negative does not in and of itself prevent somebody from repeating the Crusaders' mistakes. The motivations that animated the Crusaders, a yearning for status, purpose, and meaning, the burden of guilt, the longing for moral purity, and selective blindness to the human cost, did not evaporate with the end of the Crusades. I believe that anti-Zionism, particularly Western anti-Zionism, has similar motivations and repeats many of these mistakes. I'm of course not suggesting a military similarity, but rather comparing the sociology and psychology at play. To clarify, Zionism is simply the belief that the Jewish people have the right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland. Anti-Zionism is the belief that Jews do not have that right. So what are the parallels with the Crusades? So firstly, there's a similarity of context. Enormous growth in the number of people pursuing educational opportunities, once limited to a tiny elite, is one of the defining characteristics of our time. Students from a much broader range of backgrounds are being explicitly taught that by virtue of their education, they should be the leaders of the future. And for many of these young people, reality isn't aligning with those promises. Student debt is often crippling. Elite jobs are scarce and fiercely competitive. And where they exist, they often offer very long paths to modest pay, especially given the cost of living in major cities. This has led many of the most highly educated and often capable and driven young people in the West to feel much like young nobles at the time of the Crusades. Namely, that wealth and status have been promised to them, but are nowhere to be found. This has created a sense that there is something wrong with the cosmic order, that maybe some dark, nefarious force is to blame. And this perception is developed in parallel with a growing ideological position, often originating in university contexts, that the world is indeed inherently broken, and that it's broken because of an immoral, binary imbalance between those labeled oppressors and those labeled oppressed. Perhaps the archetypal oppressor is the colonizer in this worldview, and the oppressed, the archetypal oppressed, the colonized. And just as there existed a Catholic view of the non-Christian world as irredeemably evil, many today view the colonizer as beyond redemption. But the problem for many of the people who hold that view is that they may fall on the colonizer's side of the ledger, kind of like being a noble who believed that violence was sinful. Being a white European or white European descent of ancestors who undertook, for example, the Crusades is problematic in this worldview, to say the least. And as such, many of these people feel similarly racked with this sense of original sin. But the Crusaders were comforted when considering their own sins by the belief that the Jews, who had killed God in their worldview, were more guilty still. And many Western anti-Zionists are also comforted by the belief that whilst they may be white European colonizers, the Zionist Israel is even more white, more European, and more of a colonizer. And so, just like the Crusaders believed they could achieve remission of their sins by killing infidels and liberating Jerusalem, the anti-Zionists can negate their own sense of colonial guilt by fighting Zionists and liberating Jerusalem. And in both understandings, Jerusalem is seen as the gateway to utopia. If the infidel falls, Jew and Muslim, a global era of Christian purity is all but guaranteed. And if the most egregious colonial oppressor, Israel, is taken down, the universal liberation of all oppressed people will inevitably follow. But whilst Jerusalem is the rallying cry in both instances, this really is Westerners ultimately communicating about the West itself. Anti-Zionists today often speak in terms of global Palestine and global Israel. And by doing so, they highlight that they are not first and foremost concerned with the real-life Middle East and the people in it, as much as they're concerned about how those very real human beings support their narrative about their own society. And this explains, for example, how individuals can spend 2 years protesting for a ceasefire in Gaza, yet be distraught when a ceasefire is announced. In the same way that the persecution of Eastern Christians served to justify the Crusaders and their goals, for some anti-Zionists, Palestinian suffering has become so central to their moral identity that even imagining it being reduced is destabilizing. And all of this is to forget that the people in the Middle East actually matter in their own right. Few Muslims, Jews, Arabs, Turks, or even Eastern Christians in 1095 were interested in handing over their fate to Crusaders. So too people in the Middle East today, certainly Jews, but not only Jews, are not looking to Western anti-Zionists to determine their lives. One of the greatest weaknesses of the Crusaders was their failure to understand the people they were confronting. Their inability to distinguish Turk from Arab, Muslim from Christian, or Jew. And this proved fatal in any hope of building alliances, constructive ones, and even allowed the Crusaders to go down a path that led to their own attack on Constantinople. And when Western anti-Zionists call Israelis white European colonial settlers, often Polish ones at that, these are common criticisms in this worldview that are made, they reveal their fundamental misunderstanding. Whilst it's true that a minority of Israelis have ancestors who lived in Europe, we've already seen that they were not from Europe originally, and that their experiences in Europe were pretty horrific. Constant expulsions and mass murders, and most recently, the Holocaust, which saw in Poland, for example, out of the 3 million Jews living there in 1939, 3.3 million Jews living there in 1939, 3 million killed. A survival rate of 300,000 or less by some calculations out of 3 million. This does not scream white European privilege. Even so, Jews who were exiled to Poland and their descendants don't form anything close to a majority of Israel's population today. The great irony is that most Israelis are the descendants of the roughly 1 million Jews expelled from the Islamic world in an explicit act of anti-Zionism in protest to the creation of the State of Israel. Arab anti-Zionism essentially gave Israel its population. A population made up of people, a majority of whom have never lived anywhere but the Middle East. At the same time, the 2 million or so Arab citizens of Israel number far more than all of the Jews left in the entirety of the Middle East and Europe combined. All on less than 0.1% of the territory of the Middle East. If Israel is a colonial foreign empire built on ethnic cleansing, it is a decidedly local and unsuccessful one. And the premise of all Jew hatred, in many ways, is ultimately the belief that Jews should not have agency. That it is not for Jews to determine their own fate, pursue their own desires, and shape the world around them. That anything that looks like that is wrong. In medieval Europe, the Jew was to live as a persecuted minority and a perpetual example of their inferiority relative to Christians. For modern anti-Zionists, the Jew is to have no state, no sovereignty, and no national identity. Jews are again told they must be minorities everywhere and live at best at the goodwill of others. Is it then surprising, given 2,000 years of precisely such an experience, that Jews support the existence of one tiny Jewish state on earth? Again, ironically, Western anti-Zionism increasingly serves to motivate the minority of Jews who now remain outside of the land of Israel to consider returning. It also increasingly deters Israelis who might be interested in relocating to somewhere like the United States or Australia. Again, Israel in many ways benefits from this. And the failure to understand what Israel is, what Jews are, what Zionism is, consistently results in anti-Zionism, in many ways strengthening Zionism. And none of this is to suggest that anti-Zionists are insincere. I truly believe that the overwhelming majority of self-identified anti-Zionists genuinely believe that they are on the right side of history and admirably fighting for justice. But remember, Crusaders felt the same way. Neither group imagines themselves to be evil, ill-informed, or ill-intended. Hardly anyone ever does. But the reality is that the depths of one's convictions don't make those convictions right. So what's the lesson here? I recognize and appreciate the deep challenges many people face today, even if they've turned to anti-Zionism as a result. Their challenges are real. It's also fundamentally true that there is inherent virtue in caring about Palestinians, just as there was virtue at the time of the Crusades in caring about the fate of Eastern Christians. I'm not negating any of that for a moment. But identifying problems isn't enough. We also have to pursue a course of action that's both likely to address those problems and avoid creating new ones. The unfortunate truth is that in every generation, people have determined that the root of their troubles is the Jews. And they've concluded that if they remove the Jews through forced assimilation or persecution or exile or death, that their problems will be resolved. In not one instance has that worked. In fact, the rapidly enhanced persecution of Jews often parallels the decline of the societies that persecute them. It does not lead to problems being solved, it exacerbates them. And so for non-Jews, I'd challenge you to ask yourself this. If your society becomes so intolerant of Jews that they have to leave, what kind of society will be left behind? Will it be a society that is likely to become more tolerant as a result? Or is it more likely that another scapegoat will be found? And could that scapegoat be you? And where do you then go? Rabbi Nachman of Breslov said, if you believe that you can destroy, believe that you can repair. Every human on earth has the capacity to grow, to learn, to make mistakes, and to become better as a result. Passion is a fire. It should not be extinguished. It should be harnessed for good. The Crusaders sincerely believed that they were redeeming the world. And so too do many who now seek to purge it of Zionism. But moral fervor detached from understanding rarely produces moral outcomes. History's lesson is not to abandon passion, but to temper it with humility. There is always, always hope. But it's not enough to just say God wills this. We must will it too.